Hello, everyone. I want to thank you for joining today's cast. I am Brad from Geniecast, and I want to welcome you to Data Security and Privacy Protection in a Post-Quantum Crypto World with Fred Thiel. I'd now like to hand it over to Wade Wyant, who will be the moderator for today. Wade?
Thank you so much, Brad, and welcome YPO. It's always great to have you guys here, and it's always great to do our GCC. My name is Wade Wyant. I'm a member of YPO West Michigan. I'm the moderator today. My background is in information technology, and I've got a focus on cybersecurity. I'm also a recovering entrepreneur, or maybe not so recovering. Either way, I'm excited to welcome you to this GCC on data security and privacy protection in the post-quantum crypto world. Fred's got a lot to talk to us about today. The presentation will be about approximately an hour, and at the end, we will have Q&A. So if you want to hit the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, you can submit questions at any point. If they make sense, we'll break in and talk to them midstream, but we'll probably be holding most of them for the end. And also, just note that this is being recorded. So I'm excited to have Fred here. He's been interactive with YPO for a long time, and I've been able to see him speak at a lot of different events. Just recently, I joined him at an event at Edge, and he does a great job of presenting very complex ideas and data. I just want to read off just his bio, and then we'll hand over to him. So Fred is a senior advisor to management teams, board of directors, private equity, and venture capital firms. He also sits on several private and public boards. He is a respected expert and frequent speaker on the Internet of Things, the digital transformation of companies and industries, providing deep technology, industry expertise, and strategic advice on transformational value creation. That's a mouthful. The process of generating growth and shareholder value. Fred is a current member of YPO Gold and a former chapter chair of the YPO California Coast. Please welcome Fred.
Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on wherever you are. Wade, thanks for the great intro. And hello, YPO. I love doing these types of events. I've had the opportunity of presenting on this topic at CES and at YPO Edge. The good thing with post-quantum computing in the future is you're always talking about stuff which is coming to happen in the future. I think what we'll find is that people are really looking forward to kind of figuring out what's going on here. Sorry, I'm just going to share my screen with you guys and really understand what's going to be happening in this post-quantum world where everything really gets kind of turned upside down. So with that, I'd like to get into kind of the presentation. And again, as Wade said, put your questions in chat and we'll leave plenty of time at the end to get into that, if that works for you guys. Okay. So I'm assuming that my slides are showing here because I don't really see what's
It looks, Fred, it looks great. You're showing great. So
perfect.
Keep rocking.
Awesome. So what we're going to be talking about is data security and identity protection in a post-quantum crypto world. And I might sometimes say PQC as a way to abbreviate post-quantum crypto because it is a bit of a mouthful. But think of it as everything will change the minute quantum computers come on the scene. And it's kind of like the advent of PCs from a world of mainframes, though from a power perspective, most people didn't think PCs were more powerful than mainframes, but the impact on our world and how technology affected us was huge. No different than 10 years ago when smartphones like the Apple iPhone came on the market. The revolution that has occurred in how we interact with technology thanks to the smartphone and the ability to measure, monitor, see, track, and communicate has gone up hugely as we were able to be untethered from our desktops. So quantum computers are going to have effects way outside of just data security. They're going to have effects from our ability to process large volumes of data, and they're going to have effects on how we communicate even beyond the security aspect of that. So Niels Bohr, who, for those of you who are physics fans would know who he is, has a famous saying, which is predictions are notoriously difficult, especially when they concern the future. And predicting the future is kind of like predicting the weather. People are happy if you get it right, and if you don't get it right, people have forgotten by that time because you're talking about other predictions. So just take everything with a grain of salt that you're going to hear here, but I think a lot of it is very relevant, especially if you or your company leverage things like log-on identities for bank accounts, how you wire money, how you transfer data, how you share data. You know, for example, what is the value of the data that you hold within your corporate data repositories? How susceptible is that to hacking? What protections do you have? Quantum computers change that whole game. And so if you think about all the ways in which you use and protect data, quantum computers are going to have a significant impact on how you secure that data. So the security of crypto, and by crypto I mean really cryptography and the ability to encrypt and protect data, you know, relies on the fact that the algorithms that we use today for encryption require so much computing power that the time it takes will make it unattractive, and the cost that it makes it unattractive for the average hacker, other than nation states or very highly organized gangs, to really try and hack into your data. And you know, RSA has been a standard for many years. What are called public-private key algorithms. And those of you who have dabbled in cryptocurrencies know that you do a hash to create your IDs, and that's how you protect your cryptocurrencies. Well, those are all encryption forms, and they're all forms of algorithms that are mathematical in nature, and many of them base themselves on factoring large numbers. So if you remember sort of elementary school math, you'll remember that, you know, if you have to factor the number 4, it can be factored as 1 times 4, 2 times 2, for example. If you then grow the size of the number, factoring it becomes very difficult because the number of permutations of potential factors grows. And so that's why the key length, when people talk about 128-bit encryption, 256-bit encryption, that key length affects the complexity of the math related to it. And as computer power has gone up, so has key length, as a kind of ongoing battle to make it continually unattractive or reduce the ROI on trying to hack into something. But quantum computers really have the potential of not only vastly increasing the compute power, many factors of magnitude beyond what we have today, but because of the inherent way that quantum computers work. You know, a normal computer is binary. It's either on or off, true or false. Quantum computers can have multiple states at the same time. Information in a quantum computer can have multiple states at the same time. And therefore, it can manage much larger, wider permutational mathematical computations than traditional computers can. And you know, luckily, obviously, people have been worried about this, and you know, what is the impact going to be? And a number of companies have been very focused on doing research to figure out really what do we need to do to replace the algorithms and the security processes that we have used today in the future, so that when nation states and others have access to quantum computers, we'll be able to protect ourselves. And just by way of background, in one of my many roles, I'm chairman of the board of a German company by the name of Utimaco, which is a nearly 30-plus-year-old company that's a leader in the cryptography space globally, and has been very active in this post-quantum cryptography research world with some of the top researchers in the world at Microsoft, Google, and other places. And so we've been very active in really trying to help companies and governments understand the risks and work with government bodies that create standards around these things to really put in place algorithms and processes that will make this less of a risk in the future to our everyday lives. So digital communication is a fundamental technology, and back in the day of kind of, if we go back before the internet, sort of pre-1995 days, you know, email wasn't very used outside of sort of corporate silos. It certainly wasn't used heavily to communicate between people outside of the academic world very much. And communication was really primarily done by fax and phone, etc. As the internet grew up, all of a sudden we started building, the internet of people, where we connected people via computers to the internet so they could communicate and you could start sharing data. And now all of a sudden, the fact that your computer was connected to the outside world made it susceptible to being able to be hacked. Not only that, but your communication with other people via email, instant messaging, chat, etc., video products like this, was susceptible to hacking and intercept. And so then all sorts of countermeasures had to be developed around that. Human to machine is something that has started growing now, where we are interfacing with things. Every time you go up to a modern car that has keyless entry, you are communicating with the car. You have a key in your pocket, that key communicates with the car. When you use your smartphone to look at the state of your alarm system, it's a human to machine interface. When you use your smartphone to do online banking, that is a human to machine communication. And so as we look at Internet of Things and interacting with everything in your home, from your Google Assistant to Alexa and Amazon, and hopefully I didn't turn on everybody's Alexa right now by saying the keyword, or your oven, whatever the product might be. That is very much a human to machine interface issue. And there's been enough fear spread around the concept of, well, is Alexa or Amazon Assistant listening to everything I do? Well, if a hacker could hack into that, potentially yes, and they could get a lot of information. So protecting not just the communication channel, but the data that's in it. And something most people don't realize is the historical data, meaning being able to get access to communication you made in the past also has some important implications, and I'll touch on that in just a little bit. Lastly, it's machine-to-machine communication. As your car drives through a toll lane, you most probably have a transponder that communicates with the toll mechanism. Every airplane flying that is sort of less than 5-7 years old has data systems that are communicating with the ground relative to the status of the engines and what the engines are doing, the status of the flight control systems. And if somebody could, a bad actor could get access to that, they could potentially crash planes. And I know that's kind of a rather sort of shocking example to use, but it could be as simple as getting access to the power grid. If you shut down 5 places in the power grid in the US, you could shut down electricity in this country for an extended period of time. And if any of you have lived through a crisis where, whether it's a hurricane or other, where you've been without electricity for 5 days, you start realizing that a community without access to electricity for 5 days has no cash, has no fuel because the fuel pumps at gas stations don't work. Refrigeration has stopped working, so food becomes a problem. And it can be very challenging. So the machine-to-machine world is an area where cryptography is very critical, and where keeping bad actors out is very important.
Fred, it's striking to me that as you go through this list, you talk about where cryptology is necessary. Basically, you're saying everywhere. I mean, there isn't any part of your life or any interaction you do digitally that you want to be in the wild, right? I mean, maybe you share on Facebook, that'd be about the only thing. Just about everything else you do digitally, or machines that you have, or things that you have that do things digitally, encryption's an important component, I'd say. And I think you were seeing an expansion of encryption, especially over the last couple of years. You say that's true?
Oh, absolutely. We take it for granted that our data is protected. As an example, people look at the shock around Facebook and Cambridge Analytics and what happened with the release of that data. I would say the vast majority of people don't really understand who holds what data about them and how much they hold. And more importantly, every time you make a payment using your iPhone in a store, using Apple Pay, and anytime you log on to your bank account, anytime you use Facebook login to access all sorts of websites, you are sharing your identity and your data, and you are assuming that that is over a secure connection and that that data is secure. And so anytime you log into something or a device has a token, which is kind of a way to log in without you having to type stuff, you expect that to be secure. And, in some cases it's not. So it's a very pervasive part of our lives in everything we do, and will become even more so, unfortunately.
Fred, one more quick comment. You're making the case for why this is so important. And you talk about bad actors, and most people think of either cyber criminals or what we refer to as hackers. But bad actors can be companies that have control of the internet at certain points. And I'm not saying any of them would do this, but you think about the large telecoms who control the bulk of the internet. If they chose to, if this was unencrypted, or if they could find a way to de-encrypt it, they could be stealing data that could be very powerful. The Cambridge Analytics type example, where they're not necessarily doing anything negative to you. They're just taking facts about you that should be secure, but they found a way to unsecure and get out of that data. So it's not just bad actors who are criminals. It could be corporate citizens who are bad actors who take advantage of it. So that's why it's just so critical that everything be encrypted. And this is cryptology is important, fundamental of our current internet.
Absolutely. Give you a case in point. Vodafone in the UK, which is one of the larger telecom providers there, they're also an internet provider. And so if you think about, you type in a URL in your browser, you type in search terms, all that data goes to your internet service provider, your ISP, and they then route it to Google or wherever, and all that data is logged. So everything you type into the browser and everything you send across the internet, your ISP knows. And that's why people always say it's important to use SSL or HTTPS as the URL when you're connecting to something, so the content of your communication can't be read by the ISP. Well, this particular ISP, and this was a number of years ago, started using a tool by a technology company that was meant to do ad targeting. So in other words, helping them help advertisers better target their consumers, because it would analyze what people were searching for, what people were typing. Well, that information gave that company access to effectively everything people were doing, their bank accounts, their login codes, and it created a huge problem in the UK. And the company ended up having to shut down finally, because the carrier got so much of a pushback from the authorities and the like. But to your point, companies can get access to this data and use it for malintent from a perspective of competitive malintent, which is typical industrial espionage purposes, or even competitive malintent. And competitive malintent, there are companies outside of the US who collaborate with bad actors and in order to sabotage competitors. So imagine a world where a pharmaceutical company's manufacturing systems, their SCADA systems, their machines, if you would, that are controlled using computer control systems. Somebody hacks into those systems and adulterates the mix of the recipe, if you would, of the drug, such that every 13th pill would be poisonous to its taker. And then yet the pharmaceutical manufacturing system would log everything as being normal. Nothing was being done wrong. And then that company could either do a ransom attack to the pharmaceutical company and say, we're going to let people die, and we're going to publish it's your fault because you're manufacturing these incorrectly, or you're going to pay us some large money or license us a technology. And this has actually happened. It just doesn't get published very often. And the same thing happens in hospitals. Their systems get taken for ransomware. And though that's not a traditional corporate bad actor, it is a cyber criminal. And this is it's a major issue, to say the least. So as we look at cryptography today, most people don't really realize what level of cryptography or type of cryptography is being used to protect their passwords. But most typically it's RSA-based encryption, which has been around for years and years. And it's this concept of public and private keys, where there is a key that, when matched with your key, gives you access to things. And that is what's called a typical asymmetric, meaning there is less work on your side and more work on the back end to encrypt and decrypt information. If it were a symmetric encryption, it would take just as much processor time and work on your side as it would on the other end. And the challenge is, if you have a smartwatch, it doesn't have enough processing power to do symmetric encryption. So asymmetric encryption using public-private key mechanisms is what everything really uses today to communicate. When you log into your bank account, you type your name and password, that's hashed into a key that then goes against the public key and gives you access to your bank account. So it's a system that, generally speaking, has been fairly secure, but in the world of quantum computers, you put enough horsepower at something, you can eventually brute force crack it, as they call it. So what's very important today is to think about, what are the cryptographic primitives that are used? A cryptographic primitive is think of it as a methodology. Most of them are asymmetric, based on RSA. And so it's really important to realize that the only reason why we have been safe to date is that basically the computer hardware and the ability to brute force by having enough brain power solving a mathematical problem has not been there to make it economically viable. And that is what quantum computing radically changes. NIST, and this is just some good background information for everyone, works together with the NSA, and NIST is really the National Institute of Standards around Technology. And what NIST does is determine what types of algorithms should be used and what level of security those algorithms provide. So if you have a NIST level 4 encryption methodology, then in theory you have a very, very secure level of cryptography. And if you then match that with something called FIPS, which is another standards body, you start getting into levels of security and encryption that are sort of government grade or military grade. And that goes all the way from not just how impervious the passwords are to hacking, but also the physically where the password is held and what device can that device be physically connected to. Is it completely air-gapped from the network? For example, again, those of you who have been playing in the cryptocurrency world, this whole concept of keeping your crypto keys written on a piece of paper instead of on some piece of electronics that somebody could hack is a kind of a throwback to the caveman days of security, but it's a much more secure way than leaving it on a piece of electronics that somebody could hack. And what most people don't realize is that systems have gotten so sophisticated that if a bad actor can monitor the power consumption of your computer, they know exactly what you're typing. And yes, that sounds like science fiction and it sounds shocking, but our friends at the government agencies that do this have developed tools and have characterized the processor of computers and operating systems well enough to know the exact aspect of what the computer is doing based on a particular power drain. And there have been proven cases where passwords and login identities have been hacked using those types of tools. So it is more than just the encryption you use, it's also how you protect the systems. But we're just going to focus on the encryption.
Fred, on the NIST, I would also encourage people just, as you're working with your IT professionals on cybersecurity in general, right? Because we're talking specifically about cryptology and also quantum computing, but as we branch into cybersecurity in general, NIST has been a really up and coming standard. They've got a great maturity model. And if your internal IT professionals aren't aware of this or thinking about this or talking about this, I'm assuming we're talking to OYPOers, which are presidents and CEOs of companies. And if you're not hearing about this, encourage them to check it out. It's a great organization, and they've pumped out some really, really good stuff in the last couple of years. I would encourage them to check it out.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great recommendation. And especially, if your company in any way is doing what's called key management, which is how you handle the public keys of your public-private key systems. NIST has some very specific recommendations as to how you should do that to protect yourselves, because if somebody can hack into your key management system, they effectively have the keys to your kingdom and can get into all of your systems, adulterate data, get access to customer data, and do lots of damage. So their recommendations are very good. And if you have a corporate information security officer, or if your IT group is doing any type of key management, you should definitely have a look at that. So that was a great recommendation. So what is a quantum computer? To keep it kind of simple, think of it as we're doing math based on the laws of quantum mechanics and entanglement at a subatomic level. And typical computers today are based on really transistors that can have two states. They're either on or off. And that's why computers are based on binary technology. And we build our systems around this system of programming gates. So our software is written, so if a condition is yes or no, true or false, then it goes one particular path and it works its way down that way. So if you think about, you have a very complex math problem and you're trying to factor a number that is 256 digits long. And if you want to just kind of Google sometime factoring large numbers and get an idea of how much compute power and time it takes using traditional computers, you'd see that it's very complex to factor a number with 256 digits in it. You start by dividing it by 1, then dividing it by 2, then by 3, then by 4, then by 5, et cetera, all the way up to the 256 digits. And you figure out what all the particular permutations are. In a quantum computer, because it can be in multiple states at the same time, instead of you going down a flow chart, if you would, down a path of doing the math one by one, it can do multiples at the same time. And it can see how close it's getting and save a whole pool of potential variables and operate on them or permutations simultaneously. And then when it finds the right one, it just flips to that state. That's kind of a high level perspective, but quantum computers aren't brand new. They've been around in the laboratory for quite some time. Los Alamos had a quantum computer that was operating at 7 qubits. A qubit is kind of the quantum computer equivalent of how we talk about megahertz with processors of computers, or teraflops in processing power. But it was in 2001, the Los Alamos computer was a 7 qubit computer, and it was able to already then start cracking certain algorithms, but hugely expensive. These computers need to be kept in supercooled environments near 0 Kelvin almost, because they need to operate at such high speed, and the physics requirements, if you would, of these systems are such that they, up until recently, have been very complex systems to build. Almost on the scale of a particle accelerator, if you would. Obviously, technology has advanced a long way in the past 18 years. And IBM and Intel and others now have quantum computers that operate at 50 qubits or more. The Chinese have a quantum computer that is up in a communication satellite that can communicate through entanglement with the ground. Now, what does that mean? So if you're familiar with quantum mechanics, string theory and the like, there's this concept of entanglement where you can take two particles, for example, 2 photons, and if you can entangle them, meaning they sort of become almost shared in their content, and then separate them, the minute you change one on one end, the other one on the other end changes to the exact same state. So you're communicating, but you're not sending anything. You're just changing something here, and this miraculously changes here. So from a communications perspective, quantum computers, through entanglement, can in theory communicate in a way that cannot be intercepted because you're not transmitting any data. The problem is you have to have those two elements together in the beginning and then separate them, and you have a one-to-one communication medium. You can't have a one-to-many yet. Now, that's one use of quantum computing for communication in a hackerless, non-interceptable way. similar to what are called kind of one-time keys. Any of you who were kind of World War II buffs would know that the spies used to have a book where there was a limited edition, and the two spies would have the exact same copy of the book, and their code would be a one-time code, meaning they could write a page number and a word number on the page, and if you didn't have the book, it was gibberish to you and couldn't be deciphered, because as long as you didn't continually use the same "the" on the same page in the book every time, it would be very hard to figure out what somebody was saying. That's how this quantum entanglement works. But quantum computers, as relates to post-quantum cryptography, is more about computing power applied to the hacking side of it. So as we look at cryptography, quantum computers really come into their own around code breaking. And the interesting thing with with quantum computers is that similar to the old days of mainframes, these can operate in the cloud, and you can literally rent time on them. And though it's hugely expensive today and will be for 5 or so more years, it will be very pervasive in the 10 to 15 year period. And just like you use Amazon AWS to build your applications and run code and store data, you will use time on a quantum computer to do what you need to do. And the primary initial customers of those systems are going to be people in the world of medicine, materials, physics, trying to design new materials, weather research, health research, but also governments wanting to basically use quantum computers for cryptography and cracking codes. Because industrial espionage or cyber warfare is becoming more and more important. Even some people have proposed that the next world war will not be based on bullets, but it'll be based on bits.
It's interesting you say. We're even starting to see that, right? There's some good things coming out of the talks in North Korea. We'll see where that goes. But if you read even the Wall Street Journal, and that's not necessarily a technical journal, right? And we're talking about an investment journal. They talk about the North Koreans and how they've progressed digitally, and how much they progressed with their ability to attack in that manner. I'd say we're already at that level. We're already at that at some level today. Not being very articulate, but let me ask you a quick question. So you talk about the computing power, which I think we all get it. Quantum computing is going to be a big jump in computing power if they can figure out the temperature thing, if they can figure out how to manipulate this, all those things. As they do that, though, is this like going from a horse to a car? Is this going from a car to a jet plane? Is this like going from a jet to space speed? How can we measure the speed that this would give us in a term that we all understand?
Great question, and I'll try to answer it by saying if we think about the original sort of biplane, the Wright brothers plane,
sure,
being the traditional way we use computers. So basically, you're moving air over the surface of a flight surface, and that creates lift. And that evolves by putting bigger and bigger engines, and you eventually get a jet engine. But the concept is still the same. You're moving forward and creating lift over the wings. Well, now add a rocket where flight surfaces have no implication for lift. Or imagine teleportation. So this is kind of like going from the Wright brothers to teleportation, because in theory, quantum entanglement is what will allow us to do teleportation, where you can literally go from one location to another instantaneously, because something you do to a set of molecules or electrons in one place will automatically happen in the other, and you will be in both places at the same time. So not to scare people too much, but the way quantum entanglement kind of really works is that light is a waveform until it's observed. So this is basic quantum mechanics. When you observe something, you change its state. And so one of the great reasons why this works great for communication or teleportation or things like that, is that when you do something to the set of electrons on one side, the electrons on the other side will change in the exact same way. And so the challenge is, how do I get the entangled electrons from point A to point B such that I can now teleport between those two places? So if you think about science fiction and sort of gates out in space, and we talk about black holes and wormholes, well, in reality, it's going to be sort of quantum gates where you have two gates that are entangled, and if you go into one, you're actually coming out of the other one. In reality, you're in both places at the same time. But that's just something to be sort of thinking about. But that's that magnitude of difference between, you know, getting on an airplane and taking off versus teleportation is kind of the where the impact quantum computers will have.
So it's speed like we can't even imagine compared to our current technology.
Yeah, I mean, it's an abacus compared to a computer, if you would, is another way of looking at it. And so it's not just the speed of the individual device, but it's the massive breadth of stuff you can do. So it's not just the velocity through the pipe, it's the width of the pipe that expands as well. So the applications here are huge. You know, those of you who are familiar with forecasting weather models or complex you know, air traffic control models, where there are, you know, lots and lots and lots of variables, lots of factors that can affect it. You need to run lots of permutations. Traditional supercomputers have done that using very linear forms of computing, and quantum computers let you do that in a massively parallel way, such that you know, weather forecasting accuracy should go way up. The ability to predict and identify disease states and disease conditions, the impacts of genetics, things like that, will go up dramatically. And as we look at the impact of that on our lives, it'll be huge. So just briefly going to touch on this concept called the Shor algorithm. The Shor algorithm was really created as a way to see what it would take to crack an exponential, a factoring algorithm. So again, RSA codes are based primarily on factoring. And the example here in the red box is kind of, you know, if you take 937 and square it, then doing the square root of it, of that number, gives you the two factors, the two sides of the key. But if you take the number below and then try to factor it and look at all the various factors, it takes a long time to get. And that's only a 6-digit number, by the way. Imagine a 256-digit number or a 512-digit code. Gets even harder. So in 2001, IBM and Stanford ran the Shor algorithm for the first time on the Los Alamos quantum computer. And they found that they were able to crack that code very efficiently. And that was even back then with a 7-qubit computer. And again, now the standards are kind of around north of 50. So the only cryptographic primitives, meaning algorithms, if you would, that are able to withstand these types of attacks are AES-based hash functions with sufficiently large security parameters. So the key length has to be very, very long. And all commonly used asymmetric methods are going to be broken just using Shor's algorithm. So it's not even a case of, will quantum computers crack them? Quantum computers crack them today very easily. And the only reason this hasn't caused more of a panic is it's just hard to get access to a quantum computer to run the algorithm on. But again, nation states do this today. You know, it won't be long before cyber criminals have access to time-sharing based quantum computers and can do this on an even more regular basis. So that is why now is the time to kind of start looking at this, because standards for post-quantum computing and cryptography are being defined now. It'll take, you know, a few years for those to turn into actual products and algorithms that people can use. And then you have to implement them by changing out all your password systems, et cetera. And so you've got to kind of look at what has to happen for this new type of algorithms to be put in place to protect you. And that's why you really should be looking at this as something that could be actually scary, because by the time the infrastructure is there to protect you, the quantum computers will be there to hack you. So, and I'll touch on the timeline in a minute.
Well, one of the things I like to tell people when I'm working with them on this, Fred, is that this is why it's so important that you today start to figure out and classify your data, right? We call it data classification. And especially a lot of YPO-sized companies aren't necessarily doing this. Very large companies, Chase and Disney and people like that, they're absolutely, classifying their data and storing it. What sensitivity level is it? But you don't see that as much in mid-market YPO-sized companies. And if you don't start classifying that data now, in the future, when you need to know what's most important and what you should be protecting, you'll be behind the 8 ball. You won't be able to do it fast enough. So it's critical to start doing that today.
Absolutely. Can't underline that enough. Because you need to focus your priorities on the data that's most valuable, and so you need to really be focused on quantifying the value of your data and then looking at what do you need to secure. So yeah, this slide talks about a lot of the different types of ways to protect data in a post-quantum world. For everybody on the call, NIST will eventually release standards over the next 2 years. Security companies will develop security algorithms specifically around those. And people are already working on these things, but like all things, stuff doesn't work together unless it's based on a standard. And once it's going to be a while for the standards to be established, but once they are, all of these products are going to have to interact. And once that's in place, you'll be able to, use these things. And, your banks will deploy new systems, your ISPs and internet providers will deploy new systems, your various partners that you interface with are going to have to deploy new systems. So it's just something to keep an eye on. You don't have to worry about the specifics of which type of cryptography, because I think you'll see most of the major vendors will come out with technologies that'll be fully usable and implementable. So how soon do we need to worry? Well, and to Wade's point, if you look at the value of your data, how long does your information need to be secure? So most people think, well, if somebody hacks my communication, then they're going to get kind of what I'm doing right now, but get access to it so they could crack an email or crack a protected document. So most people can kind of get their heads around that. But what you don't realize is that all of your past communication could also be hacked. So there are things you're doing today that are protected today that somebody 5 years from today could access using a quantum computer maybe and hack. And then the question is, what is the implications of that data? Because you're not going to go back and change how that old data was protected necessarily. And so that's something you need to be thinking about, is how long is your information need to be secure, and how are you going to secure it such that when quantum computers become more prevalent, you can protect that data as well. And then how long is it going to take to retool your systems to be quantum safe? And then, how long before the threat appears? And so there's a theorem called the Mosca theorem, which kind of talks about this, but basically, about the time that if you look at, how long do you have to keep your information secure, and how long is it going to take you to retool? And then you look at when quantum computers are available, and you all of a sudden start saying, gosh, this is actually sooner rather than later. So if we look kind of at the industry timeline, the sort of the darker blue is how long it takes somebody to design a product and the infrastructure around it. And the lighter blue is kind of how long that product will live in the marketplace. When you look at automobiles or Internet of Things infrastructure, power grids, things like that, it takes up to 4, 5, 6 years to design some of these, and then they are going to live for 5, 10, 15, 20, or 30 years. What some people don't realize is a lot of the computer control systems that control our infrastructure, water, power, traffic systems, in some cases it's 30 years old. And those computing systems are very lightly protected. Because when they were originally deployed, the thought of this type of hacking wasn't even on the radar screen. And then it became very interesting to try and connect these systems to the internet so they could be monitored and controlled. And now all of a sudden they could become impervious to, or become at risk for attack. And a statistic that Siemens put out, and for those of you who are familiar with the term Stuxnet, Stuxnet was a virus that was developed ostensibly by the Israeli and US governments as a way to maliciously impact how a Siemens SCADA system, which is an industrial control system, would control a uranium centrifuge. And this was targeted at the nuclear program in Iran a number of years ago, and it was a virus that was released and specifically targeted Siemens SCADA-based systems. The virus got into, eventually got into the SCADA system that was running these centrifuges in Iran, and the centrifuges started to self-destruct while the SCADA system kept telling the operator that no, everything is operating normally. That virus, because it was released into the wild, is actually in up to 40% of the Siemens SCADA-based systems that are installed in the global infrastructure today. And so there are lots of malware products out there in our infrastructure today that if somebody can trigger them, could do some very bad things, because it's very expensive to go out and change the software in these devices today. You then go look at things like other types of systems. The implementation time might be shorter, but the life of that system in the world and its use case can be quite long. And then, lastly, you look at consumer electronics products where, a new version comes out every year and you swap it out. And so there, the risk is lower. It's really these big infrastructure projects, systems in banks, automobiles, traffic control systems, where there's a lot of concern because of the time it takes and the cost and expense to replace them. So if we look at the timeline at the bottom, NIST has effectively now collected submissions from different companies on quantum safe algorithms, and Dimako, the company I'm chairman of, was very involved in that process. So that happened in April of this year. And now that's being evaluated. If you look at the timeline, all of a sudden you see 2023, and that's when NIST has estimated that they'll be finished testing these algorithms, and they'll be implementing these algorithms starting in 2024, and they think 2027 is when a quantum computer will easily crack an RSA 2048-bit code. And if you look at most of your systems today, they're typically 128 or 256. Anything bigger than that is kind of military grade. But that gives you an example of NIST's timeline. If you then look more realistically at this in kind of a finer lens, we'll start seeing some draft standards coming out around 2020. And if you want to follow this more specifically, there's a link on this slide that you can click on. That'll show you kind of how this is progressing. But in reality, it's something that is going to take some time. And so it's going to be an arms race. Who can put out the defensive mechanisms before the offensive computers are ready to go and attacking us? And how are you going to protect yourself? Short term, you can increase your key length. Long term, you have to replace your whole cryptography system.
So Fred, if I understand you right, what you're saying is that there's two things going on right now. You have you have quantum computers that are being built and tested that we don't know when they're going to come online, but we know we're speeding up towards them. And we know that IBM and some other people have them, and we're assuming some government agencies do as well. So it's coming along. And then you're saying at the same time, NIST is trying to build a new cryptology technology or standard that may replace RSA, that once it's adopted, hopefully prior to your first commercial quantum computers coming online and being available, but once it happens, that anybody who wants to have ultimate protection of their data should start protecting then with these new standards, because as you said, they'll be able to go backwards in history once these things become available. Am I understanding you right, that I restate that correctly?
Absolutely.
And then one of the things I like to recommend to people, remind people of is that the bad actors won't need to own their own quantum computers. There will be one or two bad actors who'd be more than happy to rent out, lease out, to as needed basis, give cycles on these devices in order to crack whatever they bring to them. Just like today with bad actors with websites and other things, there will eventually become one out there. So, if you're thinking that, well, this won't apply to me because the people who might want my data will never have a quantum computer or won't have it in the next 50 years. The reality is all they need is access to one or the ability to pay for access to one, which will be pretty easy once they become commercially available and people start to buy them or build their own.
Absolutely. And, again, those of you who are dabbling in cryptocurrencies, all of the keys that protect the blockchain and your cryptocurrencies are completely hackable using a quantum computer. So again, imagine the risk of hacking on these crypto exchanges and other places. All of that immutable record that's on the blockchain that requires today lots and lots of compute power to mine and process is effectively made redundant by quantum computers. So that's an area where, as we look at blockchain technologies, making them impervious to quantum computing is going to be very, very important, because blockchain is going to be a core building block of a lot of technology solutions going forward. One thing that Utimako has published is this PostQuantum Crypto for Dummies book. On the slide, you can see the URL to the book. It's free. It's a light read, as all For Dummies books are meant to be. But if you really want to get into kind of the nuts and bolts of this, it's just a great way to educate yourself and your sort of senior IT folks on it. So in summary, so we can take your questions, because I've gone kind of way over my presentation time. Quantum computers have huge potential, but they also have huge risks for us. And the standardization journey is going to be a long one. We've already seen a lot of challenges with trying to solve for this, but there are a lot of technology leaders who are working on this. As I said, my company Utimako has been working with Google, Microsoft, and others to develop this, and we work very closely with NIST. But be prepared to transition to new algorithms in 5 to 10 years, and this is just something that we all need to be looking at. And again, more information about crypto is available, or this world is available at the NIST website too. So with that, maybe Wade will take some questions.
Yeah, if you have questions, please type go to the bottom, go to the question box, type them in. We'll make sure we ask them. Jess, it was funny, Fred. It was almost like you're reading the questions real time, because Jess asked right before you answered it. He or she said, "What are the implications for a distributed ledger system such as Bitcoin or others?" I think you did a good job of answering that. I do think it's interesting, though. Maybe you could unpack what the risk is. Like, if you're a large coin holder, is that going to be a challenge? I mean, is it better to distribute it? Where would you see the attack coming from?
Well, think of it this way. So on the blockchain, the public blockchains are published all the transactions of Bitcoin. So when it's mined, the Bitcoin goes into a wallet somewhere. And so once that transaction happens and is published on the blockchain, you have a wallet ID, which is a large number. And then there is an ID for the Bitcoin that's in it. And then somebody has private keys that they use to protect access to that wallet, such that if you want to use what's in that wallet and access that Bitcoin, you have to have your key, which is a long string of digits that you keep on maybe a Trezor or another one of these sort of USB type devices, or you have it written on a piece of paper, or you have it hidden behind a painting somewhere. And if somebody gets a hold of that key, they can take your money from you. So it's not really, who's at risk, big wallets or little. It's, you could effectively go read all the wallet IDs on the blockchain, use all the Bitcoin IDs, throw a quantum computer at it, and you'd eventually crack every single wallet that's out there. Because in the world of blockchain, you don't have to physically have access to the wallet. You just have to have access to the ID of the Bitcoin and have the key that would control access to it. That's the whole nature of this decentralized model. It's not like you have to hack into a bank to get access to money. You just have to have the keys to the credit card, and then because the money's virtual, if you can prove that you have access to the keys, you can transfer the Bitcoin from one place to another, and now you own it, as long as you can access it. So it's very scary for the crypto world.
So Fred, and so while we wait for our questions, I love your explanation. I agree wholeheartedly. I think you did a great job explaining how it would happen. I would say for people who are dabbling in cryptocurrency, or more importantly, if you're investing. So I think there's a lot of people who are hedging their bets and saying, well, I'm gonna take 5% of my net worth or 2% of my net worth and put it in crypto, because you never know where it's gonna go. And if it takes off, then that 2% becomes 50 and it's all good. If it goes to zero, then I just lost 2% of my net worth. So what's the big deal, right? I think it's a smart way of investing. A lot of people are doing that. But the challenge is that as you do that and you're buying and holding basically, is that, and I was opining with someone the other night about this, is as someone does bring on a quantum computer and they start to unlock these keys, if they're smart, they'll only steal a little bit of money at a time. And who they'll target is the people who are not active. They're not looking at their wallets. And because once you start stealing the money, then the whole thing falls apart. It's worthless because no one will trust the system. So in order for you to have value, you have to steal just enough that everybody still feels like the system has value, but doesn't destroy the whole thing. And that is probably how it'll go down. So there's a chance that sometime in the future, someone will be able to do this. Well, no one will know about it, but they'll just siphon off small parts of the not the blockchain, but of coins or portions of coins over time. Be very